My interest in culture is not circumstantial. I was born in Brazil, I married a Swede, and I have 2 British children. So you can understand that to navigate those cultural frames of references is survival in our family. I came across cultural differences by chance. I was just finishing my degree in economics in Brazil, and I was offered an internship, believe it or not, in a Swedish bank. It was very exciting for me, especially because it was so far away from Brazil. When I first started doing my internship at the bank, I was somewhat surprised to see that all my colleagues, when we had a problem of any magnitude, always reacted, in my opinion, very negatively. I even thought that perhaps the bank was in trouble. When I actually asked them, why is it that they were so negative? They looked at me as if I was coming from another planet. They didn't understand my question. I realized that it was something that they weren't really aware of. So I tried a roundabout way to try to discover why is it that they reacted so negatively when there was a problem of any magnitude. So I said, well, why is it when we have a problem, we always look at the darkest possible scenario first? And the whole group reacted like one. They said, but of course, Christina, it makes sense. If you see the worst possible scenario first, whatever happens afterwards will be better. There's security in that. That really confused me because I suspected that in Brazil, we did exactly the opposite. And furthermore, when I came back and started checking, I did understand that when there is a problem of any magnitude in Brazil, we always see the positive side first. In fact, if we don't talk about the positive first, we would not engage people at all. They will probably go home or go to the beach or leave the problem altogether. I start to realize that there are cultural frames of references that are put in place probably at a rather early age that we are not aware of. And it dictates everything we do and why. The most interesting thing is that although we are all experts in our own culture, we are the worst people to actually describe it objectively. The worst people to tell me about the British culture is British people. Too busy being British in order to be objective about what drives them to take action. But it's the same thing in Sweden or in the French culture or in the German culture. Culture hides, it seems, so much more than it reveals. And strangely enough, what it hides most effectively from its own participants. So I became fascinated by these frames of references, these patterns of behavior. I started calling them imprints, things that we use all the time, but we can't describe objectively. So it took me 15 years to devise a method to explore those cultural frames of references systematically. And of course, I drove more and more away from my original degree in economics, went to anthropology and psychology and psychoanalysis. I became fascinated to understand why is it that people say one thing in research and do something totally different in real life. So it could be said the cultural imprint bridges the gap between what they say and what people do and why. If we want to understand why is it that people do what they do, we need to go beyond asking questions. Also, as I said before, we are totally unaware of those frames of references that seem to dictate all our behavior. So if we need to understand, if we want to understand why people do what they do. We need to dive deeper. It could be said that the human mind is a little bit like an iceberg. At the very tip is opinions, what people say, and we change that all the time. At the very bottom of the iceberg, we have biology. Needs. Need to keep warm, need to breathe, need to communicate. So it could be said that at biological level, we are all the same. Why? Because we have those biological constraints. Culture comes right above biology, and it adapts biological needs and then organize individual behavior. So I could say, without fear of contradicting myself, that we are all the same because of biology and needs. We have things in common, like language, culture, experiences, and we are totally different because we take these cultural frames of references and make it our very own. Let me give you an example. For example, a universal need, like need to communicate. Let's take a very pedestrian, very small part of this need to communicate. Let's say need to communicate knowledge with credibility. In the British culture, we learn to communicate knowledge with credibility, in my view, in a very idiosyncratic way. If you're British, you learn very early on that if you want to convey how clever you are, you need to understate knowledge. I'm going to give you an example to exaggerate a little bit this structure so you can hear it. It goes a bit like, I don't know much, but I wrote 20 books. Now, it's almost like you learn very early on to actually understate your knowledge. And if you do a group discussion and ask people, once they are actually served that type of communication, they will say things like, they will never talk about the understatement, but they will say things like, oh, he or she made me feel comfortable. I felt included in the communication. And it feels so natural that it's almost like the air you breathe. And if you are British, you take this understatement and you make it your own, and you do that in your own unimitable style. I've lived in the British culture for over 40 years. I still cannot do that. It sounds fakey. So very early on, when I was talking to clients or to people in general, I understood that I have to tell them that we are in Brazil a little bit enthusiastic about culture. It may sound a bit naive to British ears because, we are enthusiastic. It could almost be misconstrued as arrogant. But like children, we are so enthusiastic about our culture that we talk and slightly overstate it. Let me introduce you another culture frame of reference. Let's cross the channel and go to France. In France, they learn to communicate knowledge with credibility in almost the opposite way as the British do. If you are French and you want to communicate knowledge with credibility, you need to overstate knowledge. But you need to overstate knowledge in a rather idiosyncratic way as well. Let's say that you are a famous mathematician. Oh no, you don't talk about math first. You have to establish your credibility on an unrelated field. You should talk about philosophy or art. You have to almost talk about Diderot and Montesquieu, and then you talk about math. If I had a group discussion with French people, they will say, oh my goodness, he or she is so clever, didn't even need to talk about math. Now, the whole thing is that whatever the French person has to say to that French audience, they are receptive to him. And we all know this is halfway there. So people are listening with interest. Now, let's cross a little bit further and go to Germany. How is it that in Germany, you actually communicate knowledge with credibility? The culture did not teach them that they have to pretend they don't know. To include others. The culture have not taught them that they need to overstate knowledge to, show how absolutely clever you are. They just say, without a hint of humor, I'm clever. In fact, you have an inkling they are clever, and I'm using humor a little bit to actually make my point, because they're called Herr Doctor Professor something. So I call it the Kaplonk effect. They go straight into the subject. And I'm going to role play a little bit so you can hear the structure a little bit. I have a very dear colleague in Germany. His name is Georg. And of course, how is it when they answer the phone? How do they answer the phone in Germany? Well, he uses his surname. He says, Hübner here. And I say, Georg, how is the family? He says, Christina. Could we talk about the family after we solve the problem at hand? Let's go straight into the problem. That's what I call the Kaplonk effect. Now, imagine a multicultural team when you have German, French, and English in the same team. And nowadays, as we all know, we don't have these multicultural teams for 10 years. They come together very quickly and they break out very quickly as well. If I am French and I hear the British people saying, I don't know much, but I wrote 20 books, immediately I became suspicious. Why? Because it sounds as if they are pretending something. They are pretending to do something or to be something they are not. And what I'm trying to say is that we become rather judgmental. And we can always come up with some historical event to say, British people, they are very shifty, aren't they? And of course, the British people are totally oblivious because that's the way you communicate knowledge with credibility in the UK. Now, imagine when the British person listened to the French saying, I'm incredible, are you fantastic? And of course, I'm using humor to emphasize my point here. They say, my goodness, they also become very judgmental. And they say, the French people, they are so arrogant. And of course, the Germans, when they hear the English talking about the weather and trying to touch base and trying to include people, they feel that they are shambolic. The French, they're talking about Diderot when they should be talking about mathematics. What's the problem with these guys? So if you have a multicultural team, it is always important to explain where you're coming. Because when I hear something that is so against my own frame of reference, it destroys credibility. I start to become suspicious of that person. I learned that very early on working in the UK because I had to explain first where do I come from? How do I communicate knowledge with credibility? And of course, when I, in England or in Britain, talked about those things, all the subsequent speakers that came after me or that they saw themselves being, they actually became aware of their own unimitable, idiosyncratic way to communicate knowledge with credibility. So, impossible to change those frames of references. It is so ingrained and is put in place at an age that we don't question those things. They become part of our identity. What I've been learning these last 30 years that I've been dealing with cultural behavior is that most of the things that we find it's natural has nothing to do with biology or nature. It has to do with our own cultural experiences. It took me forever to come up with a systematic way to understand why is it that people do what they do. And in a manner of speaking, I learned very early on, and my experience in psychology came absolutely to the point of that, is that you cannot ask people direct questions. In fact, if I wanted to be a little bit complicated, I could say, what is the question to ask in order to know which question to ask when you're trying to understand a subject at hand? If you ask about a product, for example, if you talk about the color, people will answer that. About the smell, the taste, about the advertising. The problem is that you sometimes get scientific answers to possibly the wrong questions. You don't really know what is it, what is the most relevant question that in fact will make you understand why people do what they do. That will, for example, dictate their preferences. That's why we actually don't ask direct questions. We have a way of actually having almost like a mini society instead of a focus group, where we float ideas and we let people talk about things in a much more conversational, not question and answer way. It is interesting because let's take chocolate, for example. If you have an unguided conversation about chocolate, you will see that the same person that say, chocolate, it's terrible for you. It gives you pimples, it makes you fat. The same person 5 minutes later say, and I eat it all the time. So when we are just discussing in an unguided way a subject, we don't make sense. We say we love this stuff, but we never buy it. This stuff is terrible for us, like chocolate or ice cream. We buy it all the time. So we almost need to tire the rationale a little bit in order to get to those emotional drivers that dictate preferences. And we all know that in our brain, the emotional brain dictates what people do and why. All the connections from the rational to the emotional, from the rational to the emotional is much weaker than the emotional to the rational. So we are trying really to understand those emotional drivers that are put in place through experience, of course, and actually dictate preferences. So in a manner of speaking, we are unpacking people's conversation and experiences gradually. And we get to the core of it, which is actually people's experiences. And then we are going to unpack that a bit further. This is our own intellectual property, to understand exactly what is driving their behavior. Once you have that, everything people say and do start to make sense. Even the contradictory stuff start to make sense. We used to do an exercise with clients, things like, you're going to laugh now for a moment. We used to predict the past. I mean, you must be joking. You're thinking, well, I never knew when I started that my clients didn't know exactly why was it that some products or services or concepts were so successful. I thought they knew precisely why it was so successful. In fact, people have a very vague idea of how, what made that product, issue, concept successful or not. So much so that when they try to reproduce that, they often make mistakes. Once you understand the frame of reference put in place through experience, you can go backwards and understand precisely why some brands or products or concepts were extremely successful and others just didn't fly at all. So understanding the past, I'm joking now, it can give you a very good inference about the near future. It could be said that we live in the past because when we are describing our experiences, we take a step back and describe something that has already been. But it is in the present experience, the feelings embedded on the present experience. It could be said that we feel the near future. So it is in those experiences, the feeling tone of present experiences, that open a door to the near future. I'm going to give you plenty of examples later on so you can understand a little bit more how important it is to actually unpack those experiences and go beyond what people are actually telling us. The meaning behind the words is paramount if you want to understand why people do what they do. So we spend a lot of time understanding this emotional package that is imprinted through experience. It is by understanding the dynamics of this package that we understand why people do what they do. And because people are not aware of these frames of references, for example, communicating knowledge with credibility in the British culture, as I'm not aware that I'm understating knowledge all the time, I tend never to modify that behavior. And I actually am teaching the next generation and the next to actually behave in the same way. It becomes so part of people's individual identity that to take that away, it almost I would almost cease to be me. So those cultural frames of references give meaning to people's life. That's why they change at a glacial pace. Also, it's very difficult to change that which you are not aware of. Take pain and painkillers. In the British culture, it's very difficult to articulate pain. You sound hopelessly childish. What you say, ooh, you sound in a culture that you need to be adult and in control. When you express pain, you feel or you sound like a child. Now, it's very interesting because in the British culture, it's almost if the culture has devised early warning systems so people can detect when they are almost in pain. Why? Because when you actually do suffer pain, the fantasy is that you're going to make a spectacle of yourself and you are going to make other people uncomfortable. In fact, this stiff upper lip that we hear so much as a stereotype is just a little tip of the iceberg. When we start to understand why is it that people don't want to articulate pain, is not so much because of the stiff upper lip, but because they don't want to make other people embarrassed. Because if you make a spectacle of yourself, you're going to make other people embarrassed. Now, so in the UK, in the British culture, you consume a painkiller much before you need it, just in case. It's almost like the culture put in place these early warning systems that you're going to ask yourself, am I almost in pain? And that's when you consume a painkiller. So if you're going to communicate, or if you're going to do an advertising, or if you're going to even communicate over-the-counter medicine to people and say it eliminates pain first, that is not really what people are looking for. They are looking at situations where they are in control of themselves. So if you want really to engage them, you need to show people in control first. Then you say it eliminates pain. It's almost there is like a hierarchy, if not of needs, but of dispositions that I want to have addressed. Elimination of pain is less important than being in control, which is very idiosyncratic if you're talking about painkillers. It could be argued, and I'm going to use humor a little bit, that pain is much more painful in Italy. In fact, when you articulate pain in Italy, you sound like Pavarotti. You do not sound childish and out of control. And it's always somebody else's fault, of course. So it's interesting to see that even in something that is supposed to be almost biological or universal, culture adapts those biological needs, to eliminate pain, etc., to serve its own unimitable frames of references. And first experiences are extremely, extremely important. It could be said that we never get a second chance to have a first experience. First experiences create a frame of reference that we tend to use over and over again, and subsequent experiences just crystallize those patterns of behavior. For example, when I'm first learning what is quality, my mother or my teacher did not come with a dictionary and say, oh dearie, today I'm going to teach you what quality is. No, what we learn is a whole package of information, of emotional information. The word quality is just a little label that crystallizes that package. If you want to understand what quality means, you need to unpack those package of emotions. That is the key to understand the meaning of quality in different cultures. For example, what is the story of quality in America? Very interesting. In America, they have a negative imprint, what I call these patterns of behavior of quality. You're only aware of quality when there is a mistake. In fact, the narrative, the story of quality, and I'm going to ad-lib here, it's something like, I took my car to a shop and they absolutely wrecked it. I came back and complained. They absolutely did it all nice. I am loyal for life to this company because they rectified the mistake. And it's interesting, as a consultant in America, because quality has not to do with zero defect. It has to do with the ability of correcting your mistakes quickly. If you are a consultant in America and you do not make any mistakes, you create an anxiety. Because zero defect is something that is of little importance in the culture. Somehow, if you do right the first time, it's not considered an incredible thing. It's like beginner's luck. Because sooner or later, you're going to make a mistake. And perceptions of quality has to do with how quickly you correct that mistake. It's interesting, Churchill, when he talked about the Americans, and he must have had an insight on this cultural behavior. He says, Americans always do right when they tried everything else. So making mistakes is part of the American culture. Now, you go to Japan and it's exactly the opposite. In fact, I started in a half-hearted way trying to learn Japanese. And, how is it that we learn Japanese in the West, or we learn any language in the West? By trial and error. And there was this beautiful ideogram, because of course there are all Chinese ideograms in the Japanese language as well, or part of the more sophisticated Japanese language. And I started to want to try to copy the ideograms. And my teacher says, no, you must have perfect picture inside first. I said, what do you mean? Well, you must close your eyes and concentrate on the ideogram and try to get a perfect picture of that ideogram before you even try. It occurred to ask, me to ask him, how long does it take to get perfect picture? He said 5 to 10 years. So it's very interesting that once you apply yourself so strongly to do that, imagine, you do absolutely perfect all the time. It takes a long time in the beginning, but once you start doing it, wow, you actually do it perfectly all the time. And in the Japanese culture, there is this incredible thing about perfection. If you create something perfectly, it doesn't matter if it's a marker or a sweet or whatever, you become almost like a national hero in the culture. And you're going to teach the other generation to do perfect markers or perfect sweets or perfect whatever. So it's very interesting to understand that words are just labels, but the frame of reference that we use is totally different. So in the American culture, I need really to correct my mistakes very quickly. So service is really what they are looking for. In the Japanese culture, something quite different. Perfection is a very, very important role. Now, what is your imprint of quality? Try to think a little bit about that.